Welcome back to America at 250, the podcast of the America at 250 class. I'm Beverly Gage, and I am here in the Yale studio with David Blight, who has just started his lectures this week, and we're joined from New York by Joanne Freeman. David, this is your first week of lectures. We are barreling along through the 19th century. We've gotten into the 1840s, but especially the 1850s as this really critical decade of tensions and violence and uncertainty and conflict. We all know where it's going. The people in the 1850s did not. So I wonder if you want to just start out with a quick recap of the lecture, what we've been talking about, and I have a few points that I want to drill down on as well.
Okay, great. Indeed, the template for American divisiveness and conflict, despite all the conflicts that have followed, has in many ways always been the 1850s, 1840s, 1850s. It is the only time that our political culture, our political system, tore itself apart and ended, of course, in disunion and civil war. One of the big questions we have always asked about this, and historians still flirt with it, is just what was inevitable, what wasn't, what was irrepressible, to use the term they were fond of, and what wasn't. Is there anything determined about this? Or not. If there is an element of inevitability in this descent into disunion, well, when does that come? That's more than a parlor game. It's actually a pretty serious question. Is it Kansas-Nebraska Act? Is it Bleeding Kansas? Is it John Brown's raid? Is it the Dred Scott decision? Is it the election of 1860 and so forth? At the heart of this, of course, is the huge, huge question: how did slavery and its concomitant problems and issues, economic, social, moral, constitutional, how did it tear apart our society? There have been many interpretations of that, but the fact is it became a question the political system could not contain, could not solve. And ultimately, though there were many attempts at it, could not compromise. So the great question of this section of the course is, why? Why indeed? Why indeed did you have, for the first time ever, and pretty much ever since, a third party, that original Republican Party that came into existence only in 1854 and wins the presidency only 6 years later, and becomes in some ways the litmus test, certainly for Northerners, and for that matter, Southerners, about whether this union could survive. So it's my favorite decade of American history, if no other reason than I have to explain all this conflict, and it never ceases to be fascinating.
Well, we want to get to the Republican Party.
Sure.
But before we do that, one of the obvious answers to how slavery became such a central issue is that beginning in the 1820s, but especially in the 1830s, we saw the rise of an abolitionist movement as well as an anti-slavery movement. Those were not always the same thing. I think one of the pieces that's always fascinated me about the abolitionist movement in particular is the ways that the debates they started having over these questions of slavery within their own movement become the key debates of almost every social movement that follows, right? Are we seeking reform, or do we need to tear the whole system down? Should we engage electoral politics, or are we operating outside of electoral politics? Is this about culture and morality and persuasion, or is it a practical set of questions? Who should be in our coalition? Who shouldn't be in our coalition? And on, even to the question of violence, right? Is violence a legitimate way to promote your political views? So I wonder, we've touched on abolitionism in Joanne's lectures. We touched on it a little bit in Your lectures, we're certainly going to get to it with Frederick Douglass, but can you paint the big picture of the abolitionist movement and whether it succeeded or failed?
There's only about 20,000 books on this and about 10,000 careers that have been made on this. But yes, I could try, certainly. The American abolition movement, as you just suggested, has always been the template for all future reform movements to follow, whatever the issue, women's rights, Native American rights, all kinds of questions and issues. It did have its schisms. One of the ways to understand these schisms and divisions within that movement is to see them as either on the side of what was known as moral suasion, moral persuasion, or on the side of political abolitionism. Do you confront the political system? Is it ultimately a question of power and law? Now, most abolitionists end up there by the mid-1850s and by the late 1850s, and certainly by the time of the Civil War, but they did not start there. This is an enormously evangelical, Christian, moral movement from its inception. It drew deeply on British traditions of reform, and by 1831, it had one William Lloyd Garrison, who created a newspaper in Boston called The Liberator, the longest-standing anti-slavery newspaper in the United States. He created a movement that was thoroughly moral suasionist. That is, Garrison was the real thing. Make no mistake, a devoted, radical abolitionist. But if you joined Garrison, you did not engage in politics. You did not even engage in voting. In fact, you were against voting. You supported black civil rights. You supported women's civil rights. But you also had to toe the line and believe in something he called no union with the slaveholders, a theory that somehow, in fact, it was called disunionism. If abolitionists could simply pull out of any complicity with the slaveholding republic, with the Slavocracy, then maybe over time that Slavocracy, as they called it, could be so denigrated, so diminished that it would dissolve from within. It was very much an effort to try to change the human heart as much as it was ever an effort to change law. Now, that's going to be a huge division among abolitionists. And yet it was always, we must understand, though a radical movement, it was always a very small number of the population. There's been one estimate that in some parts of the North, as much as 15 to 20% of people actually attended or belonged to some kind of anti-slavery society. Upstate New York, parts of New England, little pockets of Pennsylvania. But by and large, it's never more than 10%, more likely 5%, which is also true of most great movements throughout American history. And you cited this in the 20th century. They always had an influence greater than the numbers.
I would love to weigh in on that because I think that's hugely important for a whole bunch of reasons across all of American history. But you suggested, David, that it's sometimes morality, it's sometimes the Constitution and legality being debated is the way to push back. But what you just suggested is that regardless of which method people are focusing on, how change can be enacted, that in one way or another, that's a loud voice, that's a loud argument. And it's an example of the ways in which people coming together, even a little minority of people coming together and being united in message and purpose, and having a purpose that has that sort of deeper sort of morality, heartfelt component to it, as well as the simple question of legality and rightness, that can have a real power. And in a way, the abolitionists are the first example of that kind of real power, I suppose, first since the revolution, but really an example of how that kind of power can far outweigh the number of people who are in that movement.
And Joanne, as you said many times in your lectures, there's so many paradoxes and contradictions in American history, wherever we want to look. And that we understand it usually only through some kind of contingency, change here and change there. The abolitionists are a paradigm for that, because they were themselves walking paradoxes. They were deeply, deeply committed to freeing the slaves, although some of them, not all of them, but some of them were also, as racist in their bones as most other Americans. They had struggles within the movement of just how much they should favor or not basic black civil rights, the right to vote, for one thing, or not. On the other hand, they were a movement trying to rid the country of what was perceived to be the destruction of its future. A slave labor system growing in leaps and bounds, and that's a key factor here. You mentioned the 1820s and 30s and 40s. Every decade of the first half of the 19th century, the population of the United States doubles. The slave population of the United States is growing in leaps and bounds across the South. The domestic slave trade is growing in leaps and bounds. The South, the slave states are taking over the Southwest even before the Mexican War, up to Texas. So it's this growth. America's future is always the West. So whatever its biggest problems are, whether those were labor or slavery or technology, those problems are going to go with them and probably direct them as they go. Nothing more than the slavery problem. And again, back to the question of paradox and contradiction, one of the key things to understand is that millions of Americans could hate slavery and not necessarily be the friends of black people. We'll see this when we get to the Civil War. On the other hand, there were people, like the most radical of abolitionists, white and black, who created the first profession of reformers, who devoted their lives to newspapers and organizations and fundraising to try to destroy this system, which nobody had a right to really believe they could get rid of, if you think about it. By 1840 and 1850, you're going to rid the United States of 3 million, then 4 million slaves, the most wealthy system in the American economy, the largest single financial asset in America in the 1850s was slaves. And you're just going to get rid of it? Really?
And of course, most people, you say, okay, 15 to 20%, maybe in a place like upstate New York, our friends along the Erie Canal that Joanne spoke about last week.
And a lot of them ended up in Rochester with Frederick Douglass.
Right. So there you might have had some real popular support. But of course, the movement was hated. It was reviled. Abolitionists were themselves subjected to all sorts of violence and censure. Their newspapers were banned, etc. So I think sometimes it's easy to tell a story that's like, oh, they made this nice, they had this big idea.
And they won.
And they got together and yada, yada, yada. Progress happened and we ended up on the other side. But of course, it's more complicated than that. And the Republican Party, I want to talk about as well, because the Republican Party is a little bit in conversation with the political wing of the abolitionist movement that says, yeah, you've got to work within the political institutions we have, parties and the federal government and laws and the Constitution. But they are also quite different and quite separate and do an amazing thing in American history, which is have a successful third party. Now, this is something that we're going to see for the rest of the semester.
Many will try.
Many will try. All will fail, except the party of Lincoln. So how did that happen in this moment of such kind of fracture and divisiveness that it would stay? And it doesn't just come into existence. It dominates American politics until the end of the 1920s. I mean, this is a powerful institution. It's a powerful coalition. It's a powerful force. So how on earth did they do that in the 1850s?
Great question. And this is a chance to push back to Joanne's section of the course when we think of the terrible conflicts between the Federalists and the Jeffersonians, the violent rhetoric in that era, the hatreds, political hatreds, the idea that they were struggling for a future and the other side was the end of history if you let them in. But somehow a political culture did at least endure through that. It doesn't. And it makes us have to ask, okay, what was the issue? The issue clearly was slavery. If you're looking for a third party, if you're looking for the success of a political movement, you better have a really big issue, or two or three of them. Slavery brought together a cluster of fears, and fear in politics is about as potent or powerful a notion as you can have. The great success of that Republican Party, and they have precursors. There were little political anti-slavery movements back to the 1830s. There was a party, I mentioned it in lecture, called the Liberty Party, born in 1836. They got about 3% of the vote up in New York and probably gave that state, or prevented at least Henry Clay from winning it. Then there's the Free Soil Party, which emerges right out of the Mexican War. They hold a national convention in 1848, and they got 10% of the popular vote in the presidential election of 1848, unheard of. And they were the beginnings of this strange coalition of people who were quitting one party, going to another. But eventually, what they had going for them, when the Republicans are born out of the Kansas-Nebraska brouhaha, the crisis over that bill, and the now opening up of potentially the entire West to the expansion of slavery, it meant that every small farmer, every immigrant clerk, every young man and his family in New York or Cleveland or wherever across the North believes their future is in the West. Progress is in the West. Mobility is in the West. If you're going to get land for your kids, it's going to be westward, westward, westward. But what if slavery controls that? What if slave labor controls that? And the Republicans brought together a host of about 6 or 8 issues we've come to call free labor ideology. They didn't always call it that, although they had slogans like free labor, free men, free soil. And what they were this idea of mobility. America, what's America about? It's mobility for the single individual common man.
Mobility and opportunity.
Yes. It was like a fanfare for the common man. Right. Go west.
So is this just updated Andrew Jackson with some anti-slavery thrown in, Joanne?
Oh, wow. No, I mean...
It's even bigger than that.
Yeah, it is. I'm singing along in my head with you, David, because
Is there a free labor song? I can't remember.
There probably is that I do not know.
I'll figure it out.
We'll get to John Brown's Body soon.
Well, that's pretty good, yeah.
Well, yeah. What's brilliant about this and what you're talking about here, David, is... it pulls together people who, for all the reasons you're saying, want free labor and don't want slave labor because that's going to affect them and farming and their future. It pulls in people who are more on a moral journey and who feel slavery is immoral. It pulls in such a wide range of people, which it's important, I think, to hammer home what you're saying, because I think people think of this entire period and the Civil War as North versus South.
Yeah.
Slavery versus no slavery. Yeah. And what we're talking about here is a real mix. When I first plunged into this in the process of writing my most recent book, first of all, I found it's North, South, and West. And we tend to forget that that's part of the equation. And then just the simple fact of the mix that is in that Republican Party. And they agree on their main purpose. It's a great purpose. But they come at it in such different ways, and they could fit under that umbrella. It made me think of the main character who's sort of at the heart of the last book I wrote. And he has this sentence or 2 sentences about slavery. And it shows one person struggling with everything you're saying here. He's like, well, slavery is bad. He's a clerk in the House of Representatives. Slavery is bad. We should get rid of slavery. But slavery is a Southern issue. So maybe Northerners should have nothing to do with slavery. And as a matter of fact, maybe we just shouldn't talk about slavery, because if we talk about it, it's going to make it worse. Yeah. It's like this bundle of, I don't know what to do, but it's all there at the same time. But if you can pull all of those wills and all of those emotions and all of those ideals and ideologies together, as you're suggesting here, you have real power.
And think about how many times in American history, since, to only look ahead to Bev's century,
I own that century.
You own it. Oh, what power
why do we call it the American century and not Bev's century?
Yeah.
Really...
All I get is the century of progress, and it wasn't really always progress. Anyway, some of them were drawn simply to these ideas of individual liberty. And think about how often it's a pretty simple idea. The rights of the individual have just dominated our political culture. And by that, I mean, these are people, small farmers, small businessmen of the future who hated oligarchies, who hated concentrated power. They had come to fear this idea of, there are only 300,000 or 400,000 slaveholders, but they could run everything. They could rule everything.
They had really good names for them to write: the slave power, the slaveocracy.
The slave power. And I want to stress that, and I will again next week in the lecture that leads up to the War and Secession. No slogan was ever sold quite as well or fast in American politics as the slave power conspiracy, partly because there was something to it.
Yeah.
2/3 of all presidents before Lincoln, slaveholders. 2/3 of all members of the Supreme Court before the Civil War, slaveholders. Control of committees, control of the power of the government.
Congress. They had a block of power in Congress. They acted in unison. There was a slave power.
There was. And the Republicans seized on this early on in 54 in just some off-year elections. And then in 56, where they come close to winning the presidency in their first time out, and they really seized on it in the wake of the Dred Scott decision. Because look what they had now. The Supreme Court itself had just ruled that all of these debates and all of these fights, we'll just settle it for you. Slavery can go everywhere because of the Fifth Amendment.
I want to move us along to Frederick Douglass, who is really our main character in the readings this week, although it is interesting to think about those poor presidents of the 1840s and 1850s, which is when you sit down and you say, recite all the presidents, that's the first kind of stumbling block. Joanne's guys, we can sort of see them each as these individuals. And then we get into the Harrisons and Pierce and
Van Buren,
Millard Fillmore. I went a couple of years
ago. First Harrison, second Harrison.
Yeah, I went to Millard Fillmore's house in East Aurora, New York, which is where he lived for a while when he was a lawyer, and it's just this little tiny cottage. It's not Mount Vernon. It's not Monticello. It's like this little tiny lawyer's house. I also want to register that they let you touch things there. And I played Millard Fillmore's piano.
Nah, how many people can ever say that?
Yeah, it was big. It was big.
To our students out there, go home at the break and tell your parents. And one of my professors played Millard Fillmore. And if they ask you who Millard Fillmore was,
you'll have an answer.
Well, that's a different.
You'll have a little answer.
But so I think the figure, right? I mean, we're going to get to Lincoln soon, but in a lot of the ways we tell history, and this is partly thanks to your biography, David, Frederick Douglass is really the great figure of the age. One of the people who critiqued and embraced the United States in various ways over his career, someone who had a powerful personal story, and someone who really saw beyond his moment in all sorts of ways. So I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about Douglass, but particularly the narrative that we read for this week, which is one of Douglass's most important pieces of writing. It's the thing that really puts him on the map in his own moment as a powerful and influential figure.
Lived 20 years a slave in Maryland, 9 of them in Baltimore, which had everything to do with why he ever got to escape. 7 years later, he writes this narrative, his personal story. The narrative, short, 130 pages, depending on which edition you use, is really him putting together in narrative form, frankly, beautiful narrative form for a 27-year-old writer, the stories he'd been telling out on the circuit for 4 years. The story after story.
The slave narrative was a known genre already.
He's exploiting a known genre. Josiah Henson's had sold even more than his would.
Well, if I could weigh in as you're getting into this, David, you said when you launched this, and I think it's maybe important as a starting point, you did say this is the greatest of the slave narratives.
Yeah.
So if you could talk about what Bev just raised, which is what does a typical slave narrative do, and then get into what Douglass does.
I call it the greatest, and I'm not alone there, because it's probably the most beautifully written. It is the most thoroughly literary of the slave narratives. It does much more than describe a life. The slave narratives were already a genre, as you suggest. There were about 100 of them in one form or another. Some were very short and were basically just newspaper columns. Many were full books in length that were published before the Civil War. There are a lot of them already, even by the time Douglass comes on the scene, but no one had ever written quite like this guy could. Now, the genre also has certain methods and conventions, really. They all begin with, I was born. My name was, my parents were, if they know. In every male slave narrative, there's the moment, the last time they saw their mother. There's a theme of breakup of family in almost all of them, which appeals to that kind of deep, romantic, sentimental American sensibility of the middle of the 19th century. They are all, of course, about slavery, which Americans were fascinated by. They wanted to know more about it, and they never got access to it, quite like through these narratives. But they are also manipulative texts, of course, like all autobiographies, and no one more manipulative than young Frederick Douglass, because he was such a good writer. It's the story he wants you to know. But note the story he's telling you. It's a coming-of-age story. It's a story, at first, about the violence of slavery. There are about 4 beatings in the first 2 chapters. You get to watch his Aunt Hester beaten to a bloody pulp. You get to watch a slave named Denby shot in a river. You get to watch a slave named Barney, who for years has run the stables at the Y Plantation, just beaten in front of his own son and in front of everybody because he didn't have the horses ready on time. The sheer absurdity and brutality of slavery is right up front, but then it becomes a psychological journey into the minds of slaves and slaveholders. I've always said, and I say it in my introduction to my edition, that there's no deeper theme in that narrative than Douglass's portrait, or his penetration, if you like, of the slaveholder's mind, of what this system had done to the people who were in charge of it. And he does it with Thomas Auld, one of his owners. He does it with Aaron Anthony, the other owner. He does it with others. He does it with overseers he names. He does it with ministers he names, the ones he likes and the ones he doesn't like. So it's that's got a lot to do with why its readership was so large. This is not just a bunch of stories of bloody treatment. It's a penetration into that world of control, not only of bodies, but of minds. And Douglass will say this many times in his life, that he feared more for his mind than he did for his body while he was a slave. If his mind could be controlled or destroyed, and there are moments when he tells us it virtually was. But those, of course, are also setups for his resurrections, which is, of course, one of the most powerful themes you can have in writing about the self.
If I can jump in, I think there are, in looking through the narrative again, one thing that really struck me was this appeal to a common humanity, right? It was not a simple tale of oppressor and oppressed, although that's certainly part of the story. It was about how this system distorts the human personality, distorts the human mind, engenders cruelty, engenders ignorance, engenders division that doesn't need to be there. And so even from the earliest moments in his description of his life, there's this vision of something else. And of course, the other thing that is so striking is, how did Douglass become who he was? How did he do this, right? I mean, I think that's one of the questions that's at the core of your biography, which is so much about his writing and his oratory. But there's this fun, how did this 27-year-old manage to do this and become who he became?
Well, the simple answers to how Douglass became Douglass are, on the one hand, dogged ambition, and on the other hand, a lot of good luck. he's taught his alphabet and his letters by his mistress in Baltimore when he's 7, 8, 9 years old at first. He learns how to read. He doesn't know how to write when he came out of slavery, but he knew how to read, and he became obsessed with it. Like any child, he found one thing he was good at, and that was words and language, and he loved it. He loved hearing preachers. He used to sit by hours and hours with an old storefront black preacher named Father Lawson, he called him, or Uncle Lawson, and they would read the Old Testament together because Frederick could read and Lawson wasn't a very good reader. So here he is, he's 12, 13 years, 14 years old, and he's reading biblical language. He doesn't know. Who understands the Old Testament when they read it now entirely? But it doesn't matter. He was getting the King James language in his head, and language became music to him. Language became an element of power. Language became something he could manipulate on other people. He's doing that already as a teenager while he's a slave. He's learning how to preach even while he's still a slave. So writing's another matter. He has to learn that the hard way. He didn't spell worth a diddle at first. He had help with that. But by the time he sits down at a little table at his kind of cabin house in Lynn, Massachusetts, in the winter of 1844-45, to kind of sum up all these stories he's been telling out on the circuit and put it into a narrative, he's ready to tell the world who he is. And a lot of people have always said, without evidence necessarily, that he wrote this because everybody was accusing him of not being who he said he was. You can't be this intelligent. You can't speak like this if you're a former slave. And it's true. He wrote it down and put it out so he could say, oh, this is who I am. But this was somebody, too, that I've maintained with, I think, some good evidence, was damaged, greatly damaged by those 20 years as a slave, and he needed to figure out who he was. He needed to know how that kid from the Eastern Shore got to the Western Shore of the Chesapeake and got into the places he was now, speaking to all kinds of people about that experience. He did not understand his own story until he could write it.
Well, that's, I want to go back to, you used the word preach a few minutes ago, David. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned before we started that
he was a preacher.
Yeah, well, but I mentioned that
he even got sort of ordained.
I mentioned that there was a passage that struck me when I was rereading.
Oh, I can't wait.
Right, so I'm reading a passage. I'm on Metro North, rereading this to prepare for this week, and I'll come to it in a moment. But my immediate response to it was I was very caught up in it emotionally. Yeah. And, by the time it appears, you're a couple, 30 pages in or something. So you kind of have a sense of him. And he is so skilled with giving you a sense of his personness in the narrative, of who he is and the struggles that he has. So I was already with him. And then I come to this and I really felt it. And I actually had to stop and put the book down because I thought, I don't remember having this response. And then just before our conversation, I picked up the book again to re-look at that passage and had a totally different response. So let me set it out for you. It actually was the passage in chapter 8 where he's talking about his grandmother. Yeah. And he talks about how she had outlived her usefulness. Yeah. So there's a hut built in the woods that she's just sort of sent out to on her own. And he describes, her lonely existence. The children, the unconscious children who once sang and danced in her presence are gone. She gropes her way in the darkness of age for a drink of water. Instead of the voices of her children, she hears by day the moans of the dove, by night the screams of the owl, all this gloom. And then at the end, he says, this devoted mother of 12 children is left all alone in yonder little hut. Before a few dim embers, she stands, she sits, she staggers, she falls, she groans. She dies, and there are none of her children or grandchildren present to wipe from her wrinkled brow the cold sweat of death. Now, I read that. I know. I read that on the train. Yeah. And I had to stop.
You want to know the truth?
No. Wait, let me finish before you tell me the truth. Okay. I want the truth. All right. But let me finish first, because otherwise I'm going to not tell you the other half.
Oh, okay.
The first half was this. I had an emotional response.
Yeah.
When I picked it up just a half hour ago. Then what I thought was, wow, that's some really effective writing and indeed preaching there. Because if you think of what preachers do, on the one hand, they have an agenda and they're trying to give you a message. And on the other hand, they're trying to touch your heart. And they have to do both of those things
of course,
at the same time. So the second time I read this, I saw him as the writer.
Good.
The first time I read this, I saw him as a person. And I was fascinated, first of all, at the two different responses, but also to the degree to which I was so in that narrative with him.
Oh, wow. Okay. I'm sorry to report that
there was no grandma?
There's grandma.
Okay.
That's Betsy Bailey. That's Grandma Betsy, who was a huge force in his life. But he made most of that up.
I'm sure.
Yep. And he actually, one day we'll have to admit it, because in his famous letter, quote, letter to my old master, which was the public letter he writes in 1848 to Thomas Auld, where it's like 3.5 pages. It's one of the most amazing anti-slavery documents of all. He uses Thomas Auld as his symbol, as his foil of all that's evil in slavery. And one of the things he accuses Thomas Auld of is putting his Grandma Betsy out to the field.
Whoa.
He got challenged on several things by Thomas Auld and Auld's family. And later Douglass admitted, yeah, I actually didn't know that. But it didn't diminish in the least the power of that propaganda. And every slave narrative was anti-slavery propaganda. That's the purpose of it. Every anti-slavery speech was propaganda.
This is such skilled propaganda.
It is. He was brilliant at it.
Right.
That's the secret of this piece, this book, as a work of literature.
Well, exactly.
It's what it
I
is.
was totally sucked in. And then I was coming around not to the fact that it was made up, but to the fact that, wow, that's some really strategic writing and crafting there, right? So just the fact that I could have both of those points of view within not a very long time apart really drove home for me. Yeah. First of all, why this would have been powerful in its time. And I hope in a moment you'll explain how and why it becomes a bestseller, why it was powerful and how it was powerful in its own time. But then also just the skill of the writer, his skill, not just with words, but as Bev said a little while back, his skill with recognizing the humanity or lack of humanity in the people that he's writing about and putting that on paper.
And think about our students right now. And of course, they're all listening, I hope. on their first time reading this, possibly even a little quickly, they understandably may have only the one reaction and don't have time for the second or a third or a fourth. Or you can read any great work of literature many times and see something. I'll give you one other example real quick. There's the magnificent scene in the narrative where Douglass tells us that on Sundays, Edward Covey didn't beat his slaves. And he would give them time off. And Douglass tells us he went and he sat on this ridge on Covey's farm where he could see the Chesapeake Bay. And what follows is this 1.5 pages, gorgeous, metaphor-filled description of the white sailing ships on the Chesapeake. There have been poems written about this now, etc. The white sailing ships become his swift-winged angels that fly around the world. Oh, that I could be on one of your decks. And on it goes. It's unforgettable. It's stunning. Now, you might think, well, that's just good literature, too. But in my first ever tour of the Eastern Shore with a writer named Dick Preston, who had written a book called Young Frederick Douglass, a journalist who wrote a great piece of history, he took me out to that farm, the Covey farm. And this is a long time ago. I was only a graduate student then. And we got out of his car. We walked over some kind of little fence. We walked out on a ridge. And at some point, Dick said to me, "Look out there." And there it was, Chesapeake Bay on a July day full of white sailing ships. And I remember saying something to Dick like, "Oh, my God, he didn't make that up." I've always kind of assumed that's just one of those literary moments because it's so florid, it's so powerful. It's just, and by the way, he even puts his own voice in quotation marks as though he's quoting his teenage self. And I thought, oh, come on, man, this is literature. This isn't.
So I had this marked. I will say, David.
There are other places in the book where one can wonder that. Is this just Douglass the writer, or are these actual experiences? The truth is they're all partly actual experiences. He adored his grandmother, and therefore, the use of her, if you like, in that story.
We only have a few minutes left. So I'm wondering if we can leap out of the narrative and talk about a few other things. So one is, I think the document that most people, when they encounter Frederick Douglass in class, in AP U.S. history, is probably what they encounter, and that is the 4th of July speech, which has become famous, I think, not only because of its powerful oratory and its effective writing and some of the same techniques that we see in the narrative, but because it's such a profound expression of ambivalence about the United States, of hopes for it and its revolutionary legacies, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and yet an utterly searing condemnation of it at the same time, right? That famous line, "This is yours, this holiday. It is not mine." And so I wonder if you have reflections on the context in which he's saying that, but also just on this broader ambivalence that he was able to articulate so well throughout this period, which is, I have hopes and I have real fears that these hopes will never be realized.
It's 1852. Context is sometimes all. It's only 2 years after the Fugitive Slave Act. It's in the midst of all kinds of fugitive slave rescues. It's an election year. It's just 3 months after the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Most of the 600 people in Corinthian Hall that day in Rochester probably were already reading Uncle Tom's Cabin. There are other contexts. Douglass, there's a letter where Douglass says he worked harder on that than anything else he'd ever done. It shows. It's the rhetorical masterpiece of American abolitionism. I always refer to it as a symphony in 3 movements. I can do this quick. The first movement is almost the first third of the speech. And I know symphonies usually have 4 movements. His only had 3. But the opening is a tribute to the founders. I mean, he just sets up his audience, the glories of this document, the genius of Thomas Jefferson. This is a day to never forget. And then comes the change. Then comes the hammer. Why? He says, "Pardon me. Why have you invited me here?" And then he goes through this beautiful, powerful section where he even uses the 137th Psalm. By the rivers of Babylon, there they sat down and hung their harps upon the trees, and you demanded of us a song. I didn't come here to sing for you. I came here to make you hurt. And the whole middle of the speech, then, the second movement, becomes this litany of the horrors of slavery, including the hold of slave ships. And Douglass has that ability with language to make you use your senses. He can make you smell a slave ship. He can make you hear the chains. He can make you see the blood on a slave's back. And then that long middle section comes to an end with this incredible metaphor of a reptile coiled up at the nation's heart, ready to rip out your heart. And then there's a little pause. The final movement is quite short, but he says then, but it's not quite too late. Your nation is still young. It's still malleable. It's still possible. If you act, you can still save yourselves. And he ends with, my God, about 8 verses from a poem song by, of all people, William Lloyd Garrison, with whom he's just had a terrible breakup, called Go Sound the Jubilee. So it ends on this hopeful biblical notion that this can still possibly be redeemed, but redeemed from horrible pain. It's the classic Jeremiah, an altar call, calling the flock to the altar to confess. He knew he had a masterpiece. when he gave that speech that day, he had it already printed up, hundreds of copies to take on the road. And immediately in his newspaper, he offered them for, what was it, $10 for 100, and he was ready to go on the road and start selling them, which he did. But it comes at a moment when the slavery crisis is just exploding, and here we are in the next year and a half is the lead up to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the breakup of the whole political culture system. So that speech is always there for however we want to use it. Just reading it on the 4th of July, which is a lot of towns do now. In fact, the Beinecke Library does here at Yale. Or if you want a vision into just how bad this polarization was. And I've often wondered, and I couldn't get good evidence on this, he's invited to give this speech by the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society of Rochester, who were his friends, close friends. And I don't think they got what they thought they were going to get.
I'm sure.
They got a thunderstorm, they got a hailstorm thrown on them. And I've always had this vision.
They also got put on the historical map because I'm not sure we would be talking about the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society of Rochester
we wouldn't
had they not had
we
this
wouldn't
speech.
know about it.
But
No, we wouldn't.
If I could say one last thing, only because I think it's going to continue to be true with other people and other texts and other events as we go forward in the course. In the same way that we were just talking about, one of the things that's striking and powerful about that address is the fact that it is both preaching and searing at the same time, right? It is sending a strong message, a strong political message, but the searing power of that. And I think, speaking more broadly, when you're looking at political movements and social movements that have succeeded in American history, it would be worth considering what they pull out of their toolbox that gives them a kind of power. And I think both of those components are there for the most successful sort of activists or resistance or movements pushing for change.
And if I can jump in and get us maybe to a last few comments. So one of the things that's really striking about the 1840s and 50s is that it's not just Frederick Douglass doing this, right? He's not the only one talking about the Declaration or the Constitution. Right down the road from him is the Seneca Falls Convention, in which women activists led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton write their own declaration of sentiments, drawing on this political language, political traditions, a similar kind of ambivalence. But then you look at someone like John Calhoun, who we also read this week and you talked about in lecture, and he's saying, no, wait a minute. I am the true heir to the American Revolution. I'm the protector of American liberty. I'm the protector of the promises that were made in that founding moment. And this is not very far in the past, right? In the 1850s, the Revolution era is about as far in the past to those folks as World War II is to us. So that's
Even
to
Vietnam.
say, right, there are mostly people who did not live through, right? The generation that lived through it is gone or disappearing.
But they've directly inherited it.
But there's a living, active memory about all of that. So I wonder if you could finish up with a couple of reflections on that.
Well, what we get here by the 50s, even in the 40s, but especially the 50s, is a realization that there are two vast and eventually hopelessly divergent ideologies in battle here. One is what we could generally call an anti-slavery, northern worldview about individual rights, the rights of the small farmer, the free labor ideology approach to the future, versus the pro-slavery, pro-Southern quest for expansion to expand their civilization, their system, their slave society. Both believe the most fundamental things about America that they've inherited, that revolution, its creeds, that Declaration of Independence, the claim of liberty. Both increasingly believe that the whole thing's at stake. And they do try to compromise it. They tried hard in 1850. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was a compromise. It was a bad compromise. It didn't last at all. There will be all kinds of compromise measures thrown around on the eve of secession or in the middle of secession. But what they continually find is that they have a future they cannot reconcile. And that's the tragedy of it. That's the deepest tragedy of it. And those out there who just want an American history that is progress and things always come out all right. This didn't come out all right. This did not come out all right. We don't want to live the 1850s again. And every time we think we are, do something fast. Prevent it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, next week, I guess you're gonna take us into war.
It's going to happen. It's going to come.
I thought so. I thought that was the next chapter.
We could head it off, but I don't think we can.
Dang.
No, sorry. We're gonna do secession next time, but I'm gonna do a whole lead up to that. These competing conspiracy theories of each other. We think we have conspiracies. We think we're polarized. They were polarized, and to a degree, tragically so, even helplessly so. Although there have always been historians, Joanne knows this as a political historian of the 19th century, who have said, well, if they just would have settled down, if they just would have not had all that furious politics, what did James Roundell call it? The unctuous fury of politics. If they could have just put politics aside, as though, how do you do that?
No, this political historian does not agree with that.
I know you don't. But there were a lot of people who did for a long time, and I don't know if I'll have time in lecture to address all of that. But Americans have been fighting and arguing about this question of what could have been about the coming of that Civil War ever since it happened.
Well, I'm sure we're going to get the final word on that this week. So we'll just settle all of that and move on. But thank you all for listening to another episode of the America at 250 podcast. And we will be back next week with secession and Civil War.